didn't park. Put your hands right there.
Okay.
You got any guns?
No.
Put your hands on the car. For what? I'm in a police car, and you're trying to get away from me.
No, I'm not.
You just
Stop resisting. That's the phrase heard seconds before a handcuffed man screamed in pain while pinned against the hood of a police cruiser. According to later court filings, one officer allegedly forced the suspect's arms upward even after the man repeatedly said his shoulder was injured. Witnesses claimed they heard what sounded like a popping noise. Medical reports would later describe severe elbow and shoulder damage. But here's the part nobody at the scene knew yet. The man in handcuffs was not a violent fugitive. He wasn't a gang member, and he wasn't some unknown suspect refusing orders for no reason. He was an undercover police chief operating in a highly classified multi-agency operation. And by the time officers realized who they had detained, the situation had already exploded into a legal, political, and public relations disaster that exposed serious questions about police communication, use of force, and officer discretion. How does something like this happen? And once officers realized the mistake, did they make the situation even worse? The incident reportedly began on a rainy Thursday evening outside an industrial corridor near a shipping district on the edge of the city. The man at the center of the encounter was 48-year-old Deputy Chief Marcus Hale, a veteran law enforcement officer with more than 2 decades in policing. According to internal sources later cited by local media, Hale had been participating in an undercover surveillance operation tied to suspected weapons trafficking and corruption investigations. Because of the nature of the operation, very few officers reportedly knew his identity or assignment details. They rely on you not knowing your rights. This channel makes sure you do. Subscribe and stay informed. And if you believe more people need to see this, share it and let me know your thoughts in the comments. That's important. Undercover operations often rely on compartmentalization. Information is intentionally restricted so leaks don't compromise the mission. But sometimes that secrecy creates another problem. Uniformed officers may encounter someone connected to an operation without realizing it. According to reports, Hale was driving an unmarked dark SUV and monitoring a suspected target location. At some point, patrol officers in the area reportedly received a BOLO, a be on the lookout alert, involving a suspicious vehicle connected to possible criminal activity nearby. The description allegedly matched Hale's vehicle closely enough to trigger attention, and that's where everything started going wrong. Body cam footage later released in part begins with flashing lights behind the SUV. One patrol officer approaches cautiously. "Driver, step out of the vehicle." Hale reportedly identifies himself only partially. "I'm law enforcement. I need a supervisor here immediately." Now this is important. Undercover officers are often trained not to fully expose their identity during active operations unless absolutely necessary. But patrol officers responding to a suspicious vehicle call may interpret vague answers as evasive behavior. The responding officers reportedly ask for credentials. Hale hesitates. "Call your watch commander right now." But here's where things changed. One officer reportedly believed Hale was impersonating law enforcement, and from that moment forward, the tone shifted dramatically. "Hands where I can see them. Face away from me. Do not reach." Witnesses later said the scene became chaotic fast. Officers reportedly pulled Hale from the vehicle and placed him against the hood. According to body cam audio, Hale repeatedly says, "My shoulder is injured. I can comply, but don't force my arms up." Instead, officers allegedly attempted to pull both arms behind him aggressively while ordering him to stop tensing. One officer can be reportedly heard saying, "If you're a cop, you know better than this." Then came the critical moment. Despite already being partially restrained, Hale was pushed forward against the vehicle while officers attempted to reposition his arms higher. Seconds later, he screamed, "Stop! My arm! My arm!" Another officer yelled, "He's resisting!" But according to later allegations, Hale's elbows and shoulders were already compromised from prior injuries, and the force used during the restraint caused catastrophic damage. At one point, an officer reportedly demanded, "Put your hands on the car." But Hale's hands were already cuffed, and viewers later watching the footage online immediately focused on the contradiction. How was a handcuffed suspect supposed to comply with commands requiring full arm mobility? At this point, the legal question becomes complicated. Generally, officers are allowed to detain individuals temporarily if they have reasonable suspicion that criminal activity may be occurring. A suspicious vehicle matching a bolo can absolutely justify an investigative stop in many jurisdictions, and officers are also permitted to use reasonable force to secure a scene if they believe someone may be armed, dangerous, or refusing commands. But the key word is reasonable. Courts typically look at several factors when evaluating force. What threat did officers reasonably perceive? Was the suspect actively resisting? Were officers facing immediate danger? And was the amount of force proportional to the situation? Now here's where body cam footage becomes incredibly important. A person verbally arguing is not automatically the same as physically resisting. Likewise, delayed compliance does not always justify escalating force immediately. At the same time, officers often have only seconds to make decisions under uncertainty. If someone claims to be law enforcement but refuses to immediately produce identification, some officers may see that as suspicious rather than reassuring. This can depend heavily on department training and local policy. But another issue emerges here. Once someone is handcuffed and physically controlled, the legal justification for additional force becomes much narrower. And courts have repeatedly scrutinized situations where officers continued using painful restraint techniques against restrained individuals who no longer posed an immediate threat. But the scene didn't calm down after the handcuffs went on. It got worse. According to reports, Hale continued demanding a supervisor while officers searched the SUV. One officer reportedly opened a compartment containing encrypted radios and surveillance equipment. That immediately alarmed officers. Why does this guy have all this gear? Another officer allegedly replied, "This is either federal or this dude's deep into something." Meanwhile, Hale reportedly refused to discuss operational details publicly at the scene. And this is where officer discretion matters. Instead of slowing the situation down, some officers reportedly interpreted Hale's refusal to answer questions as continued noncompliance. At one point, body cam footage allegedly shows an officer pressing Hale downward while another attempted to reposition his cuffed arms again. Hale screams a second time. Then another voice enters the scene. A supervisor arrives. "What's going on?" The responding officer answers, "Possible impersonator, being uncooperative." Then the supervisor asks Hale directly, "Who are you with?" And finally, according to reports, Hale gives a name connected to a regional task force. Everything changes instantly. Silence. Then confusion. Then panic. One officer reportedly steps backward and says, "Oh no." Within minutes, additional command staff arrive. Cameras are redirected away from certain vehicles. Officers begin speaking in lowered voices. But by then, paramedics were already responding, and rumors about the encounter were already spreading internally through police channels. Now the deeper issue becomes excessive force and post-restraint conduct. Generally, officers can handcuff suspects during investigatory detentions if safety concerns exist. Courts have often allowed temporary restraints during uncertain or potentially dangerous encounters. But once a suspect is restrained, injured, or no longer actively resisting, officers usually have a legal duty to adjust their tactics accordingly. That doesn't mean every injury automatically equals misconduct. People can get hurt during lawful arrests, even when officers act within policy. But a court may examine whether officers ignored clear signs of distress, failed to accommodate known injuries, or continued force after compliance was achieved. And there's another issue here: contradictory commands. If a suspect is handcuffed, pinned, or physically limited, officers still need to give commands that are realistically possible to follow. A court could potentially ask, was the suspect truly resisting, or was the suspect physically unable to comply? That distinction matters enormously. Department policy also matters. Many agencies specifically train officers to avoid upward arm manipulation once a suspect complains of shoulder injury, because it can cause severe joint damage. Now, officers may argue they believed Hale was tensing his arms intentionally or preparing to fight. That's a defense departments often raise in use of force cases. But critics later argued the body cam footage appeared inconsistent with a genuine threat scenario once Hale was restrained. And this is where legality and judgment separate. Did officers possibly have legal authority to stop and detain him? Potentially, yes. Did that automatically justify every tactical decision afterward? That's a very different question. Within days, the incident became national news. Local media reported that Hale suffered multiple fractures, torn ligaments, and nerve damage requiring surgery. The department initially released only a short statement saying officers responded to a rapidly evolving situation involving conflicting identification claims. But public pressure grew after partial body cam footage leaked online. Civil rights groups questioned the level of force used. Police unions defended the responding officers, arguing they were dealing with an uncertain and potentially dangerous encounter involving someone who refused immediate verification. No criminal charges were ultimately filed against Hale. Instead, attention shifted towards internal accountability. Reports later indicated at least 2 officers were placed on administrative duty pending review. The department also reportedly launched an internal investigation into tactical communication failures between undercover units and patrol divisions. Meanwhile, Hale's attorneys prepared a civil claim alleging excessive force, negligent supervision, and failure to follow department restraint policies. One especially controversial allegation involved officers continuing painful compliance techniques after recognizing Hale's law enforcement status. The department denied intentional misconduct, but the damage was already done. Not just physically, institutionally. Because the incident exposed something departments rarely want discussed publicly. What happens when police systems fail against their own officers? So who was right here? The honest answer is, parts of this situation likely justified police concern at the beginning. A suspicious vehicle, limited information, a man claiming law enforcement status without immediately providing full credentials, those are factors that can legitimately raise officer caution. And patrol officers do encounter impersonators, that's real. But accountability matters most after the threat level changes. Once Hale was restrained, injured, and repeatedly communicating physical limitations, officers had a responsibility to reassess the level of force being used. And this is where many critics believe the response crossed the line. Did the officer have legal authority? Maybe. But having authority does not automatically mean the decision was wise, ethical, or necessary. Another uncomfortable question also emerges here. Would this situation have escalated differently if the suspect had not eventually been identified as a police chief? Because critics argue the tone shifted immediately once supervisors realized who he was. That perception damages public trust. People expect police restraint standards to apply equally to everyone, not only after someone important is identified. At the same time, undercover operations themselves carry risks. When communication breaks down between specialized units and patrol officers, dangerous misunderstandings become possible. And unfortunately, body cam footage across the country has shown how quickly confusion can spiral into force. The biggest lesson from this case is that high-stress encounters can deteriorate incredibly fast once communication fails. For civilians watching this, the takeaway is not to argue your case physically on the roadside. Stay calm when possible. Avoid sudden movements. Ask clear questions. Document everything afterward if legally allowed in your jurisdiction. If officers begin questioning or detaining you, ask whether you are free to leave. If the situation becomes criminal or custodial, request legal counsel and address disputes later through the legal system. And for law enforcement agencies, this case highlights the importance of de-escalation, injury recognition, and interdepartmental communication, especially during undercover operations where identities may not be immediately verified. Because once force is used unnecessarily, the damage cannot simply be undone with an apology. Do you think this was understandable police confusion during a dangerous stop? Or did officers take a routine detention way too far after the suspect was already restrained?